Avon Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. Trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the pink symbol ABN-AF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Avon's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avonresources.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Kris Sims, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome back to the show, Kris.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Canada, of course, now in a trade dispute with Saudi Arabia because the Saudis didn't like being criticized for their poor human rights record, and all Canada did was ask that 2 human rights activists be released from prison. Meanwhile, the Palestinians, who Canada just gave $50 million to, has sided with the Saudis. Jordan, who Canada over the years has given hundreds of millions of dollars to, are siding with the Saudis. Does this prove that some of this foreign aid is poorly placed if they're going to criticize us?
I think it's proof that taxpayer money often goes places where the average common sense Canadian would rather it not, frankly. Quite often we'll see large sums of our money go to countries or organizations that have very questionable human rights records, to put it mildly. And just speaking personally, I've been reading about Saudi Arabia now for most of my adult life, and as a woman who leaves her house by herself, wearing what she wants, drives her car, reads what she wants, works where she wants, it's shocking to see the treatment of women, 50% of the population, in a place like Saudi Arabia, where women are virtually under constant house arrest. They usually cannot go anywhere without a chaperone or some form of a male guardian. And as a feminist and as a libertarian, I think that strikes a lot of people as surprising. So even the criticism that Canadians offered to Saudi Arabia, it was mild, and they were defending human rights activists, which is something that Canadians have long done. Canadians are deeply proud, and rightly so, of our ability of what we call soft power, of speaking firmly and clearly, of being a moral compass, of leading by example, and telling countries that they need to act in a better manner. So, for example, there was even way back in the time of John Diefenbaker, one of our former prime ministers, of course, at the time of the Commonwealth meeting, stands were taken then about apartheid in South Africa. And Canada actually was one of the lead countries denouncing apartheid in South Africa. And so anybody listening who's a big history buff or even very recent Canadian political history buff can pull up some of the audio from that, from the Diefenbaker era, and then more modernly, they can pull up some of the House of Commons footage back when Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was in power and his Foreign Affairs Minister was Joe Clark. And they played a pivotal role in urging South Africa to abandon apartheid. And they were able to do that through very careful channels and through very careful language. Now, whether the Department of Global Affairs or Foreign Affairs, whatever it's called now in Ottawa, went about this the right way, we're not sure. That's something that's left up to experts and to professors and to diplomats. Perhaps this could have been handled in a more careful manner, perhaps not as publicly. But what's upsetting now is that we now need to brace ourselves because much of North America, especially Canada, we are still dependent on foreign energy and foreign oil. And as, of course, any of us who lived through the OPEC crisis in the 70s knows, Saudi Arabia is an extremely powerful world player, and that's because of oil. And so hopefully Canadian taxpayers and consumers don't pay the price for this fight that's going on right now, and they're able to de-escalate it quickly. But it is upsetting from a foreign policy perspective, seeing countries like Jordan not taking our side.
Well, is it true that Saudi women can be whipped if they wear sunglasses because the religious police there believe that to be a sign of vanity?
Oh, it's amazing. There are books, literally shelves of books full about this. And frankly, since, I haven't been there, so it's one of those things that even as a former journalist, I cringe to talk about with authority. But frankly, there's so many books on this from people who have escaped, who have left there, especially women, who detail carefully their day-to-day lives and how they had to live. That nothing there would surprise me. And so there are morality police, I think they're usually referred to. It's obviously not the same language, but that's generally what they are. Their code of dress, their code of behavior, everything is very, very strictly controlled. And so anybody who picks up a good book on somebody who actually lived there, especially as a woman, and then reflects on it and talks about it freely and openly here, it's a good read. For example, there's a lady, she's very, how do I put this, intense, so she's not everybody's flavor, but she is a recognized human rights activist. Ayan Hirsi Ali lived there for a few years when she was a child, and she documented it very carefully in a lot of her books, what it was like to live there as a woman and as a teenage girl. And so we have to be careful, though, because apparently now they are making concessions and they are modernizing. Women, in some cases, are now allowed to drive cars. And to many of us living here in Canada and the United States and elsewhere, that sounds like a no-brainer. But until now, it hadn't happened. So that is a victory for them. And so it's a critical moment, I think, in that country's development and our relationship with them. And as a taxpayer, I just hope that taxpayers here and consumers don't wind up getting punished for any sort of diplomatic dust-up that we're having.
Is this a good reason for the pipeline to be pushed east?
That's a great question. And so this is one of the many reasons that people often give for building energy east. And so that, of course, was a pipeline that was going from Alberta, across Saskatchewan, across Manitoba, Ontario, all the way out to St. John, New Brunswick. The only new part of it, actually, was a spur that started around Cornwall, Ontario, which is just through the border with Quebec, up through Ontario and into New Brunswick. So all the spots across the prairies and all through the Canadian Shield through Ontario was already built. It's already there. They just wanted an extension to get it out to the ocean so they can actually tank it out. And it's frankly one of the very good reasons why Canada needs, and the world needs, more of Canadians' ethical oil. Canada has one of the best human rights records. We have one of the freest, best countries in the world. We have the best environmental regulations, some of the best labor laws if you're working in those industries. It's just a great country to deal with from any perspective. And for energy, the world is hungry for energy. And this is exactly one of the reasons why we should be exporting more of it. So that way, other countries, and ourselves included, aren't reliant on places like Saudi Arabia and places like Venezuela for this essential economic lifeblood that is oil and gas. There's a great book about this. It's called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And it explains all of the amazing human progression that has occurred since the invention of the combustion engine and the use of oil and gas. And Canada falls right into that history book. And it's important that we know that and that we defend it.
We'll have more with Kris Sims right after this.
Hi, I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Rainy Mountain Royalty Corp., RMO, on the TSX Venture Exchange. Rainy Mountain's Brunswick property is located in the Rideout Shear Zone in Ontario, with grab samples running as high as 32 grams per ton gold. A follow-up drill program to test numerous targets located by recent groundwork is planned for early 2018. Please visit our website at rmroyalty.com.
MGX Minerals is revolutionizing the new energy economy with patented lithium extraction technology, replacing traditional solar evaporation using low-cost, low-energy nanofiltration. The first system of this paradigm shift technology is currently being commissioned. MGX Minerals trades on the CSE, symbol XMG, the OTCQB, symbol MGXMF, and Frankfurt, symbol 1MG. For more information, visit our website, mgxminerals.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Kris Sims. Speaking of pipelines, now that the Canadian government has taken over the Kinder Morgan pipeline from Edmonton to Burnaby, what kind of financial shape is it in, and what kind of financial picture are we projecting?
As the former U.S. President Ronald Reagan once said, some of the scariest words uttered are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." So, unfortunately, we had a bad situation with the Kinder Morgan pipeline where an independent company was begging money into our hands and getting approvals and green lights and yeses from all levels of government for about 5 years. The federal government, which had full authority and full jurisdiction, had given it its permission, had granted it a license and said go for it and twin it, build it, which of course runs from the Edmonton area out to Burnaby, trying to get the oil sands oil out to market. But the BC government kicked up a fuss, which is their right, and actual protesters on the ground kicked up a fuss, which is again their right. But the responsibility of the federal government in that case was to declare paramountcy, to say, I understand your arguments, but we have paramountcy here, meaning it's our call, build it. And then they just needed to uphold the rule of law and good government. That didn't happen. For more than a year, they dithered and dragged their feet and ragged the puck, and a private company was losing money. And they said, hey, why don't you guys buy it? And the federal government said, okay. And they used our money to buy a privately owned company that was trying to expand itself using its own money. So it's just a horrible comedy of errors. And now, surprise, surprise, that the government is trying to expand a pipeline. It doesn't do a lot of these things well. Guess what? It's costing us much more, and it's taking much longer. And I'm trying to not be a pessimist, but I'm really worried about the future. I don't expect this thing to be built at any reasonable budget or any reasonable timeline, because once you involve government, you introduce like dozens of other factors that weren't there before when a private company was trying to get it done. And so yeah, taxpayers, hold on to your wallets because they're being suctioned out. And one of the reasons is this incompetency over the Kinder Morgan pipeline. To be clear, the amount of the original purchase price plus the bare bones cost of twinning it, which was Kinder Morgan's initial price, which is pie in the sky, it's $7 billion. That combined cost is about $12 billion. That money could have been used for myriad things. It could have built state-of-the-art clean drinking water and septic systems for every First Nation region across Canada 4 times over. It could have built Sick Kids Hospital, which is a globally renowned hospital for children in Toronto. It could have started from the foundation up. They could have built that 3 times over for what we just needlessly spent on this pipeline. And now the bill is just running up and up and up. I'm worried it's going to wind up to be one of those infamous government boondoggles, and we're all going to pay for it.
Well, let's hope it's not managed by the Phoenix pay system.
Right? And as your listeners well know, the Phoenix pay system is just a software program to pay people. That's it. That's all it is. And they were warned by the department, actually, in Ottawa, saying this system isn't ready yet, guys. They apparently warned the federal government. At that time, it was the Conservatives, to be fair. Apparently, they warned them several times, it's not ready yet, we can't put it online yet. And apparently, the minister listened and agreed and delayed it and continued with the old system, whatever that was called. It could have been carrier pigeon, for all I know. So
it worked.
Right, it worked. Exactly. It worked. So what ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But apparently, with the change of government, to be fair, it's always a tumult when you're changing government. That means that there's political staff moving in, there's other staff moving out, like physically actual boxes are being lugged everywhere, files are being transferred. In that big blizzard of changeover, the new government apparently instigated the Phoenix pay system and made it go live, and it went zombie on them. And it isn't working, and it's costing us billions of dollars to even try to fix. And still there's people who work for the federal government. They do all sorts of work, everything from Parks Canada to an administrator in Ottawa, who haven't been paid. Imagine not being paid in 2 years.
We'll have more with Kris Sims right after the break.
I'm Brian Fowler, president of Blind Creek Resources Limited, listed on the TSX Venture Exchange, ticker symbol BCK. Blind Creek is focused in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. The company's key property is the Blend Project, one of the largest undeveloped lead zinc silver deposits in Western Canada, plus plans to advance the recently acquired, fully permitted historic Engineer gold mine in the Atlan district of northwestern BC. Check us out at blindcreekresources.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're chatting with Kris Sims. Kris, you say ICBC is going to change the definition of what is a good driver and a bad driver. What are your concerns about that?
So, in general, we firmly believe, and we have a campaign about this, that ICBC needs competition. It should be changed into a co-op, that this would put out the dumpster fire if we allow it to compete on a level playing field with other companies that offer auto insurance. And so that's the fundamental position there. That needs to happen. On top of all of that, since ICBC at present is a government-forced monopoly, and we have absolutely no choice where we get our insurance from, what's interesting right now is that at the highest rate in Canada, around $1,700 a year, $1,700 per year, it's the highest rate in the whole country. With that being said, about 80% or so of BC drivers qualify for the 40% good driver crazy deep discount. So when you go in there and you renew your insurance, most of us, a vast majority, have the 40% discount. Imagine if those goalposts changed and what defines a good driver changes. Say, for example, you have a minor scrape in a parking lot on a bumper. Does that then now mean that you are no longer a quote-unquote good driver? Will you then be thrown open to the extremely high insurance rates of ICBC without the seeming discount of 40%? So those are our concerns, is that goalposts could be moved tomorrow. Now, to be clear, bad drivers should pay more. If you're a crappy driver and you're running into people and causing car crashes, absolutely, you need to pay more. Good drivers should not be paying for bad. Our concern here, though, tomorrow is when we're expecting this change to be announced. Our concern here, though, is that, as David Eby says, this is a fiscal dumpster fire. And a government monopoly and a government department that is bleeding billions of dollars, it's a wounded animal. And it's dangerous. That means it's looking for money. Fast. Now. And so we're quite concerned that they could unfairly move the goalpost to redefine who is and who is not a good driver. And the catch again is that no matter how you drive, anybody listening right now, no matter how you drive, you need to deal with the government all the time. You have no choice. You can't shop around. And so even if you disagreed with their assessment of your driving, good driver, bad driver, medium driver, whatever, you can't take your money and business elsewhere like you can in other provinces. You're stuck with it. And so we're bracing ourselves for tomorrow.
Well, it was the Liberal government that created the problem. Why did they do that, and how did they do it?
In many cases, there is a problem with that because they scooped money out of the Crown Corporation that is ICBC. And that's another reason, there's so many, why we want ICBC turned into a co-op. So, number one, it would provide competition. If you wanted to go to, the Blue Steering Wheel Group Insurance Corp and you wanted to buy through them, that would be your choice. Totally fine. As long as it's approved and regulated by the insurance groups, that's cool. But one of the other reasons that we want ICBC changed into a co-op is that it would no longer be accessible to politicians looking to paper over their budget deficits. You're right. ICBC at different times in history has been used as an ATM. Very similar to what happened back in the 90s with the EI fund federally. They just scoop money out of it. When people pay ridiculously high costs for auto insurance, they expect that money to be for auto insurance. They don't expect, when they're sitting there at the driver's place getting their insurance renewed and their new stickers for their plates, they don't expect that they're putting this in a rainy day fund for politicians and government. But in many cases they are, and you're right, that's what happened. Now, granted, that isn't the only problem with ICBC. The main problem, in our view, is that it's a government-forced monopoly, and government does few things well that the private sector already does well. And so we're just telling them to please get out of this business. They started ICBC back in the 70s, which is the era of the Pinto and the Gremlin, back in the era when governments owned like telecom companies. You know, and the idea that they still own this one and they don't let people shop around for themselves is just, it's weird. And so that's why we think that it needs to be changed. Number one, to give people competition and choice so they can find lower rates. And number two, to keep that money in auto insurance and out of the hands of politicians.
Kris, you just finished a tour of southern BC. What were the people in the small towns there telling you?
So we did a tour all through the southern part of British Columbia. We'll be heading up north later on this fall into the island in a couple of weeks because we think it's important to hear from, all corners. And number one, I know this is cliche, but man, we have got a beautiful province. It is just jaw-dropping gorgeous. We're so lucky to live here, every little part of it. So we saw neat places like Kelowna and Penticton and Castlegar and Grand Forks and all the way out to Cranbrook. And almost to a rule, many community leaders are worried about a few things. One, whether they're business or in politics, they're worried about the ridiculously high cost of fuel and the taxes on it. So I was speaking with a business lady in the Kelowna area who runs a print shop, and she was explaining that to get her really nice fancy cardstock that her customers need delivered from Metro Vancouver, last year it was around $25 for the delivery surcharge. Now it's about $100, and that's because of the high cost of fuel and the taxes that are on it. And so that's a huge jump. That's a quadruple in your cost of business. And there's not much room for businesses to move, especially if they're a small business like this one. And then from the politicians and community leaders, I was hearing things like the speculation tax. There are people in Cranbrook who work in Alberta in the oil sands, but they live in many cases in Cranbrook back and forth, big chunks of the year. These people aren't speculators. They want to hang on to their properties, and they spend a lot of money when they're in Cranbrook. But now they're getting punished, and they're going to have to sell their properties. And it's not the thing causing the housing shortage. And the other thing I also heard from them, from Grand Forks especially, is that they had their massive flood there a few months ago. And the province stepped forward and said, we'll be there for you, we've got your back, no problem. But I was speaking with community leaders there, and apparently instead of just setting aside the fund and saying, this is what you need, okay, administrators in Victoria are making these community leaders, these politicians, like city council, fill out individual applications for grants as if they're getting a new bike park or something, or a public art display installed, rather than immediate flood relief. So paperwork. They still, if you go down their main street there in Grand Forks, it's almost exclusively plywood and tarps. There are businesses that have been there for, in some cases, 50 years that are completely boarded up. And it's been months and months. And this is one of the reasons why the Canadian Taxpayers Federation always argues that government needs to be nimble. And what we mean by that is it needs to be smaller, and there need to be better experts in certain departments, and they know their role, and people from Grand Forks can phone and talk to the same person who knows this file and gets it, rather than just legions of faceless drones who can always answer the phone, but they don't know the file. And it's also why we need to save taxpayers' money so that we have it on hand if a flood or a wildfire or something like this strikes.
Doug Ford in Ontario has promised $1 a beer. Is that realistic, and is that something BC should do?
That's a great question. It's one of those things that's it's kind of an interesting intellectual experiment, and it's also a neat political observation. So keep in mind that a lot of these craft brewers in Ontario who are all signing on to petitions against the $1 a beer program, if you can't afford it as a craft brewer in a small business, that's completely fine. That's completely your role and your job. But you run into problems when you start spitting on people who drink Labatt Blue or drink Molson Canadian or drink in BC Lucky Lager or Kokanee, two great BC brands. So when you start coming forward and saying it's, quote, impossible to brew good beer for $1, you are insulting millions of Canadians. And is it a neat election ploy and a good distraction? Absolutely. But it's also culturally important to pay attention to. And we also need to keep in mind that a lot of these brewers who are coming out against democratically elected Premier of Ontario, also take corporate welfare. In some cases, they'll take $150,000 in taxpayer money from Ontario as a brewery, they call them grants. So, and the CTF calls them corporate welfare. So it's interesting that these folks will be happy to take taxpayer money when the taxpayer has no say in it. Perhaps you never drink craft beer. Perhaps all you ever drink is Miller Lite or Kokanee or something. Your money's still going to the craft brewer, and that craft brewer in some cases now is really looking down on you for your beer choices. So it's something that we should pay attention to out here in BC, because it would be a very interesting exercise. What I would like to see, like forget bucket beer or whatever the term is, they need to reduce their taxes on beer, wine, and spirits. And we actually have a campaign right now against something called the escalator tax. The escalator tax is federal, and it's a tax that goes up automatically forever with no debate in the House of Commons. And your listeners may not know that right now, beer is about 50% taxes, half of its taxes. Wine is around 70% taxes. And spirits, stuff like scotch and rum and vodka and rye, 80% taxes. So what you're paying at the liquor store or at the private store is mostly taxes. And we think that's wrong. You shouldn't be able to cross the border into the States and buy it for a fraction of the cost. It shouldn't be half price.
Kris, we always find fascinating topics to talk about, and when it comes to taxes, there's no end to them.
No, unfortunately, that death and taxes. And on that note, did you see the United States is now trying to urge for an inheritance tax at different levels of it? Always fun. Death and taxes together.
Well, BC does have its own version of that because they charge you a percentage on when you probate a will.
Yep. They charge you taxes for dying.
And it costs no more to probate a will of $1 or $1 million.
No, it doesn't. And so it's, again, they'll always get you. And I jokingly said on Twitter the other day, soon, in the near future, the government will start taxing your descendants, a fee, like a property usage fee for your grave, because you're still sitting there, right?
Kris, please don't tell me that's true.
No, not yet. And I shouldn't have said it out loud because I've given them an idea.
Don't give them ideas. Kris, thanks a lot for being on the show.
Thank you, as always.
My guest has been Kris Sims, BC Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, her website, taxpayer.com. You're listening to the Goddard Report on TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show or our guests can be sent to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.